I want to be upfront about something before this script begins. When I first came across this topic, I had to interrogate my own framing. The idea that Australians literally sharpen their bayonets every day, while Americans never touch theirs. That's a legend, an emblem. It's the kind of thing old soldiers say to capture something true about two armies that approach the same war in completely different ways. So I spent several weeks trying to figure out what that legend was actually pointing at. What I found was a real and documented story, not about bayonet maintenance routines, but about something deeper. A philosophical and doctrinal divide between two allied armies that was so profound it caused genuine friction at the highest levels of command. And when I dug into the specific battles that made this divide undeniable, I had to stop more than once and just sit with what I was reading. The bayonet is a symbol, but what it symbolizes turns out to be completely real. February 17th, 1967. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. 15:30 hours. Picture the scene. A thick wall of jungle, the kind that makes you feel like the air itself is pressing in. The temperature is pushing 40 degrees. The noise, insects, birds, the distant thump of artillery somewhere to the north. And then, suddenly, silence. A company of Australian infantrymen from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6RAR, has pushed into the tree line near the abandoned hamlet of Ap My An. They expected a retreating enemy. Scattered groups heading back to their jungle bases, maybe a rearguard action from a platoon or two. What they found instead was a Viet Cong battalion waiting for them in prepared positions. 6 machine guns opening up simultaneously from the shadows. Within minutes, Australians were down in the grass, pinned, taking casualties, with their forward platoons trying to drag the wounded and still return fire. It was shaping up to be one of the worst days in Australia's entire Vietnam War. And then something happened that very few armies in the world, by that point in 1967, would still do. Something that American forces, fighting the same war in the same country just a few kilometers away, had effectively stopped doing a decade and a half earlier. A sergeant named Butch Brady told his men to fix bayonets. What I found when I dug into this story wasn't just a single battle. It was the compressed, violent expression of a philosophy that the Australian Army had carried since Gallipoli. A philosophy about what infantry combat was, what it demanded, and what kind of soldier you needed to survive it. And the contrast with the American approach, when I laid the two doctrines side by side, was so stark it was almost difficult to believe these two forces were fighting in the same war. When American forces began deploying to Vietnam in force from 1965 onward, they brought with them the most powerful conventional military apparatus ever assembled. Helicopters, napalm, artillery fire that could be called in from dozens of kilometers away, the M16 rifle firing at 800 rounds per minute. The doctrine they carried was built on the same principles that had won the Second World War and validated in Korea: mass, mobility, and firepower. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with overwhelming force. In this framework, the bayonet was an anachronism, a blade on the end of a rifle, something you kept in its scabbard because regulations said you had to carry it, not because you ever seriously expected to use it. This wasn't stupidity. The logic was sound, or at least defensible. In Korea, the last major bayonet charge in American history had happened on February 7, 1951, when Captain Lewis Millett led 2 platoons uphill 180 and cleared the crest with cold steel. Millett won the Medal of Honor. And then the American Army essentially looked at that action and decided it represented a kind of warfare it was moving beyond. The future was firepower. The future was air mobility. The future was never being close enough to an enemy that you needed a blade at all. By the time American advisors and then combat battalions arrived in Vietnam, this attitude was so deeply embedded it was invisible to the people who held it. Reading through the U.S. Army's operational doctrine documents from 1965 and 1966, you can see it in the language. The emphasis is always on standoff, creating distance between the soldier and the enemy, interposing artillery, airstrikes, and automatic weapons fire between American troops and any situation that might require personal, face-to-face killing. The bayonet is mentioned. Bayonet training is required. But as a practical matter, it exists at the margins of a doctrine organized around the assumption that American technology would always be the decisive factor. In 1965, when one RAR, the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa, American officers noticed something. The Australians operated differently. They moved more slowly. A patrol that an American unit would push through in 2 hours might take the Australians 9. They were quiet in a way that struck Americans as almost theatrical, stopping for minutes at a time, listening, then moving again a few steps. They set ambushes and then sat in them, still as stones, for hours. They patrolled in dispersed company-level groups, largely independent of battalion headquarters, making decisions in the field rather than calling up to higher command. And they carried their bayonets like they meant it. This observation seems small. It isn't. It points to a foundational difference in how these two armies understood what combat in this particular jungle against this particular enemy actually required. One American officer, watching Australian troops preparing for a patrol, reportedly remarked that the Australians were fighting the last war. Reading that, I kept coming back to one question. Which last war did he think he meant? The Australians weren't being stubborn. They weren't romanticizing a dead past. They were drawing on a specific, documented, hard-won body of experience that the American Army, for all its size and sophistication, simply didn't have. The bayonet is woven into the Australian Army's literal identity in a way that has no American parallel. The Rising Sun badge, the most recognizable symbol of the Australian Army, features a semicircle of bayonets. The Australian Army's Infantry Combat Badge, the decoration awarded for service in close combat, takes the form of an SLR bayonet surrounded by a laurel wreath. These aren't decorative choices. They are doctrinal statements. Australia entered the First World War in 1914 with an infantry doctrine built on the assumption that the decisive moment of any battle was the assault. The moment when soldiers crossed open ground, closed with the enemy, and fought them hand to hand. Gallipoli, the Somme, Fromelles, Beersheba. By 1918, Australian troops had earned a global reputation for ferocity in close combat, a reputation built partly on their extraordinary proficiency with the bayonet in trench fighting. General John Monash, commanding Australian Corps in the final 100 days of the war, later wrote that the confidence Australian troops had in their own close combat ability was a genuine tactical asset. It made them willing to move forward and close with the enemy rather than going to ground when fire got heavy. This tradition was actively maintained between the wars and reinvigorated by Malaya and Borneo in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This is the experience that matters most for Vietnam. While the Americans were largely absent from the jungle conflicts of the decolonization era, the Australian Army spent years in Malaya fighting a sophisticated communist insurgency through patrol tactics, population control, and frequently close-range ambushes at distances of 5 to 10 meters. They learned that in dense jungle, the enemy was going to be on top of you before you knew he was there. They learned that firepower doctrine, calling in airstrikes, waiting for artillery support, pulling back and letting the guns do the work, was often not an option in a contact that happened at arm's length. By the time Australian battalions began rotating through Vietnam from 1965 onward, this experience had been codified. The 1st Australian Task Force was trained at Canungra, Queensland, in jungle warfare techniques that reflected these lessons. And the bayonet was part of that training in a serious, non-ceremonial way. It was treated as a weapon that might actually be needed, because in the kind of warfare the Australians anticipated, it might actually be needed. The weapon that most Australian infantrymen carried tells part of this story. While American troops were armed with the M16, lightweight, fully automatic, designed for the high-volume suppressive fire that American doctrine depended on, Australians primarily carried the L1A1SLR, the self-loading rifle. It was heavier, semi-automatic only, and fired a far more powerful 7.62mm NATO round. Most Australian soldiers who served in Vietnam, when asked about their preference between the two weapons, chose the SLR without hesitation. It was substantially more reliable than the early M16, and its heavier round could be trusted to stop an enemy soldier outright. The SLR also accepted the L1A2 bayonet, a serious 190mm blade, not a survival tool with a can opener built into the scabbard. A weapon designed for a single purpose. Australian counterinsurgency tactics demanded constant patrolling, the laying of ambushes, and pursuit of the enemy. Units would spend long periods patrolling, painstakingly seeking signs of the enemy. Combat, when it came, was often at close range and of relatively short duration. The range of visibility in Phuoc Tuy's jungle was often between 3 and 5 meters. The enemy's standard tactic when contact was made was to hug, get as close to the Australians as possible, so that Australian artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting their own men. In that environment, the bayonet wasn't nostalgia. It was mathematics. August 18, 1966. Long Tan Rubber Plantation, Phuoc Tuy Province. 15:30 hours. It started with a patrol. Delta Company 6 RAR, 108 men, was following up on a Viet Cong mortar attack that had hit the Australian base at Nui Dat earlier that day. They were expecting a handful of mortar crews. What they walked into, in a plantation of mature rubber trees in the rain, was a reinforced regiment, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 Viet Cong and NVA regulars. On the late afternoon of August 18, 1966, Major Harry Smith and the men of Delta Company faced a vastly superior force of 2,500 heavily armed Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army troops at an abandoned rubber plantation near Long Tan. The rain was coming down in sheets. The radio was barely working. Ammunition was running out. The enemy was advancing in waves through the rubber trees, close enough that individual soldiers could identify faces through the downpour. The 108 men of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, fought for their lives in the pouring rain as ammunition dwindled, casualties mounted, and the enemy massed for a final assault. Here is what did not happen. Delta Company did not break contact and withdraw to wait for air support. They did not pull back and call in artillery and wait for the guns to solve the problem. They fought, hand to hand, in some cases, in ground contact with an enemy force that outnumbered them 20-1, for 3 hours, until armored personnel carriers finally reached them through the plantation tracks. When relief came, the Australians had lost 18 dead and 24 wounded. The Viet Cong left 245 confirmed dead on the battlefield, with estimates of their total casualties approaching 500. D Company's survival at Long Tan was a function of multiple factors: artillery support, superb fire discipline, and the arrival of reinforcements. But among veterans who have spoken and written about that day, one theme recurs: the close combat training of Australian infantry, the willingness to close with the enemy rather than go to ground, was what kept the battle from becoming a rout in the first few minutes. What I found when I dug further was that Long Tan, as dramatic as it was, wasn't the event that most clearly expressed the difference between Australian and American close combat philosophy. That happened 6 months later, February 17th to 18th, 1967, Ap Mayan Operation Bribie. On the afternoon of February 17th, 1967, an Australian force faced potential defeat in a thick patch of jungle near the coast of Phuoc Tuy Province. Operation Bribie was one of Australia's worst days in South Vietnam. Planned and organized in haste, it was an attempt to destroy a communist force that had attacked the village of Lang Phuoc Hai earlier that day. The 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment and Armoured Personnel Carriers of A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment were ordered to cut off the enemy's withdrawal routes. The Australian soldiers were expecting to encounter small, scattered groups of soldiers heading back to their jungle bases. What they encountered was a prepared D-445 battalion position, almost certainly reinforced with NVA regulars, holding a dense tree line with at least 6 heavy machine guns. Forward platoons went down in the first burst of fire. A company's forward platoons were lying on the ground. After 20 minutes of unrelenting fire, they managed to extricate themselves. Some were carrying the wounded on their backs. Unable to blast their way through the Viet Cong perimeter with a mortar barrage, an RAR sergeant named Butch Brady called on his men to give the enemy the cold steel. 300 Australian soldiers, fixed bayonets, a charge into machine gun fire. The charge was repulsed. They went again. The second assault also failed to break the position. The fighting had cost 6 RAR-7 killed and 27 wounded, while the cavalry also lost 1 killed and 1 wounded, and an APC destroyed. The Viet Cong had proven themselves able to withstand multiple Australian assaults, as well as heavy mortar, artillery, and aerial bombardment, before both sides fell back with their casualties. Operation Bribie is remembered in Australia as a defeat, or at least a near defeat. The vicious fighting at Ap Mayan was probably the closest that the Australian Army came to defeat in a major battle during the war. But here is what struck me when I read the after-action analyses. Nobody in the Australian chain of command, not the battalion commanders, not the task force leadership, questioned whether the bayonet charge should have been attempted. The AIAR focused on tactical coordination, intelligence failures, and the underestimation of enemy strength. The decision to close with the enemy, to fix bayonets and assault, was treated as the correct instinct, executed in difficult circumstances. Now compare this to American doctrine in that same period. The last documented major bayonet charge in American military history had occurred 16 years earlier, in Korea. Captain Lewis Millett led the last major bayonet charge in American history up the frigid slopes of Hill Sun 180 near Pyeongtaek, South Korea, on February 7, 1951. More than 50 enemy combatants were killed. Nearly half were skewered by American steel. Millett was awarded the Medal of Honor for the action. After Millett's charge, the American Army largely stopped treating the bayonet as a practical combat tool. It was still issued. Soldiers were still given some training with it. But the philosophical commitment to close combat, the willingness to close the distance with the enemy and fight them body to body, had been superseded by a doctrine that depended on technology to prevent that situation from ever arising. In Vietnam, that assumption proved consistently flawed. The Australians had continued to operate independently within Phuoc Tuy Province, and while the war had become a series of big unit search and destroy operations in a war of attrition for the Americans, they had pursued their own counterinsurgency campaign. What happened after Long Tan and Bribie is instructive. The Australians didn't abandon their close combat doctrine because it had cost them casualties. They refined it. They studied what had worked and what hadn't, and they adjusted. What they didn't do was conclude that the solution to close combat was to avoid close combat. The American reaction to the same tactical realities moved in a different direction. The Vietnam War increasingly became defined by body count, the number of enemy killed by firepower, which was measurable, quantifiable, and could be reported up the chain of command. This metric rewarded standoff engagements, airstrikes, artillery barrages, and helicopter gunship runs. It discouraged the kind of slow, deliberate patrolling and close ambush work that the Australians were doing, because that kind of fighting didn't produce impressive numbers. It was expensive in time and patience, cheap in dramatic footage and casualty reports. General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. forces in Vietnam, grew increasingly frustrated with the Australian approach. Increasingly impatient with the Australian approach. In early 1967, the commander U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, had complained to the Commander Australian Forces Vietnam, Major General Tim Vincent, demanding a more aggressive approach. This is a remarkable moment when you sit with it. The commander of the most powerful military force ever deployed in Southeast Asia was complaining that the Australians, fewer than 8,000 troops at their peak operating in a single province, weren't being aggressive enough. The Australians were conducting bayonet charges. They were patrolling for 9 hours to cover a single mile. They were sitting in ambushes for hours without moving. What Westmoreland meant by aggressive was more contact, more firepower, bigger operations, higher body counts. What the Australians were doing was denying the enemy freedom of movement in Phuoc Tuy Province through patient, methodical work that the metrics of the American war machine couldn't easily measure. While it is commonly held that United States forces sought to draw the enemy into battle, aiming to defeat them with overwhelming firepower, Australian forces used a different approach. Australian counterinsurgency tactics demanded constant patrolling, the laying of ambushes and pursuit of the enemy. Units would spend long periods patrolling, painstakingly seeking signs of the enemy. The gap between these two philosophies showed up in how both armies dealt with the Viet Cong's own adaptation. As the war progressed, the enemy became increasingly sophisticated at negating American firepower advantages. They learned to move at night, to stay close to civilian populations, to use the jungle for concealment, and above all, to hug. To close with American units fast before air support could be called, and fight in the dark at ranges where rifles and bayonets mattered more than helicopter gunships. Against this adaptation, the American reliance on standoff firepower became a liability. Calling in an airstrike when the enemy is 10 meters away is not an option. The Australians had been training for this scenario since before they arrived. Range of engagement in the jungle was determined by the range of visibility, which was often as short as 3 to 5 meters. In more open areas, such as paddy fields, the range of visibility was much longer, but the enemy avoided these areas in daylight. Once in contact, VC/NVA troops used the tactic of hugging, getting up very close to the Australians, so the heavy, indirect fire support could not be brought against them without also causing Australian casualties. At 3 to 5 meters, you don't have time to call in artillery. You may not have time to aim. What you have time to do is what your muscle memory and your training have prepared you to do. The Australians had trained for this. Their doctrine had anticipated it. Their bayonets were there because someone in the chain of command had looked at the nature of jungle warfare and decided that edge weapons were not an anachronism. They were a necessity. By 1969, when Operation Laverack was conducted in Phuoc Tuy Province, 6 RARNZ defeated in battle 2 main force regiments and a district company, captured and destroyed hundreds of enemy bunkers, disrupted the Viet Cong administrative system in Phuoc Tuy Province by denying the enemy vital lines of communication and supply. and irreparably damaged the military and political position of the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy Province. This was done not through massive firepower engagements, but through exactly the kind of aggressive close-in patrolling and ambush work that Westmoreland had criticized as insufficiently aggressive. By the time 1 ATF reached its peak strength of 7,672 troops in 1969. The results in Phuoc Tuy Province were measurably different from what was happening in the American areas of operation. Not different in the way of dramatic battle maps and body count statistics, different in ways that were harder to see and harder to publicize. To the end of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy, the focus of Australian efforts remained on company-level patrolling and cordon and search operations designed to put pressure on enemy units and disrupt their access to the local population. That approach arguably achieved the restoration of South Vietnamese government control in the province. Journalist Neil Davis, one of the most experienced combat correspondents of the Vietnam War, said in 1983, "I was very proud of the Australian troops. They were very professional, very well trained, and they fought the people they were sent to fight." The Viet Cong. The Australian battalion has been described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It is widely felt that the Australians have shown themselves able to give chase to the guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that have claimed so many American dead. Australian patrols shun jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage. It is a frustrating experience to trek through the jungle with Australians. Patrols have taken as much as 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. They move forward a few steps at a time, stop, listen, then proceed again. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The Australians' willingness to accept close combat, to sharpen their bayonets and mean it, made them, by every measure, more survivable in the jungle. Their readiness for the worst-case scenario, the enemy at arm's length, the moment when the weapon on the end of your rifle was your last option, produced a kind of tactical patience and sensory alertness in their patrolling that American doctrine. Organized around the assumption that technology would prevent the worst case, simply didn't generate. The numbers bear this out. Australia suffered 521 killed in action over more than a decade of fighting, with a peak strength of 7,672 combat troops and New Zealand's at 552 in 1969. The United States, with forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands at peak, suffered over 58,000 dead. This is not a direct statistical comparison. Force size, operational tasking, and the intensity of contact across different regions account for much of the difference. But within Phuoc Tuy Province specifically, the casualty ratios and the outcomes of the Australian approach compared favorably to anything the much larger American force was achieving elsewhere. And the Viet Cong knew it. The Australians' jungle warfare tactics used in Vietnam were refined by their experience in earlier jungle conflicts, and were considered far more threatening by their Viet Cong opponents than those employed by U.S. forces. That testimony lands hard. The enemy, the people who were actually on the other side of these engagements, who knew both armies from the Sharpened, rated the smaller force as the more dangerous one. Not because of their firepower, because of their willingness to come close. The war ended, and the lessons were sorted and filed in ways that suited the armies doing the sorting. The American military absorbed Vietnam as a trauma, an institutional wound so deep that the Army spent a decade trying not to think about it, and then another decade trying to understand it. The doctrine that emerged on the other side, air-land battle, and eventually the overwhelming conventional victories of 1991, was still fundamentally organized around technology and standoff firepower. The bayonet continued to drift toward ceremonial status. When American soldiers were questioned about close combat training after Vietnam, the consistent answer was that it was minimal. A few hours in basic training, a box checked. The Australian Army came out of Vietnam with its close combat doctrine largely intact, having found that the philosophy it had carried since 1914 was not a relic, but a resource. The bayonet remained on the standard kit list, and more importantly, the culture around it. The idea that an infantryman prepares for the worst case, not the best case, survived the war. In Iraq in 2004, British troops, who share much of this tradition, conducted a bayonet charge at the Battle of Danny Boy that killed over 40 insurgents. In Afghanistan in 2011, a British lance corporal led a squad in a bayonet charge after being pinned down by the Taliban. These weren't anachronisms. They were what happens when armies train for close combat and end up in it. Here is what I came away with from weeks inside this material. The bayonet is not really about the blade. It never was. It is about a decision that an army makes regarding the nature of the soldier it is trying to build. Is the infantryman a technician who deploys weapon systems from a safe distance? Or is he a fighter who must be prepared at the ultimate limit to close the distance entirely and win the fight with his body and his nerve? The Australians, with their 19-centimeter L1A2 blades on their SLR rifles, had answered that question before they arrived in Vietnam. And when Sergeant Butch Brady told his men to fix bayonets in that jungle outside Ap Mayan, he wasn't reaching into the past. He was executing exactly the doctrine his army had spent 70 years building. The Americans, with their M16s and their helicopter gunships and their body count metrics, had given a different answer. And they were discovering, at considerable cost, that the jungle didn't always permit the question to be asked the way they wanted to ask it. When I close my notes on this story, what I keep coming back to is that phrase, "sharpened their bayonets daily." It sounds like myth. What it was pointing at is real. The idea that an army's relationship to its most primitive weapon tells you something essential about the depths of its preparation for war. The Australians had depth. They had earned it. And in the green dark of Phuoc Tuy Province, that depth kept them alive.